Welcome to the Compounders Podcast. On this show, we explore the topic of compounding from various angles, including through interviews with public and private company executives, investors who focus on compounders, and newer investment firms that are building a business they hope will become more valuable over time. All opinions expressed by your hosts and the podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of SNN or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not investment advice and should not be relied upon for any investment decisions. We are not recommending the purchase or sale of any securities. The host and guests may be beneficial owners of the securities discussed. You should not assume that the securities discussed are or will be profitable. My guest on the show today is Jake Wood, the founder and CEO of Groundswell. Jake is a former Marine who founded a nonprofit organization called Team Rubicon, which has over 100,000 volunteers located around the world. Jake stepped back from being Team Rubicon CEO in 2021 to start Groundswell, a company that is attempting to transform employee giving through the use of technology. My guess is that most people haven't thought deeply about the nuances of employee giving or are familiar with what are known as donor advisor funds. But when I had a chance to use the Groundswell product, I immediately wanted to have Jake on the podcast to discuss what he and his team are building. Specifically, we covered the founding story of Groundswell, donor advisor funds and some of the issues associated with legacy offerings, the idea of everyone having their own personal foundation, the ways in which Groundswell makes money, and what Jake hopes this business will look like in 5 years. And without any further ado, here's my conversation with Groundswell CEO, Jake Wood. Jake, you've had such a diversity of experiences. I wasn't really sure where to even start this discussion. But on this podcast, we generally dive right into a discussion of a business or investment strategy. But what I'm interested in why you chose to join the Marines right after graduating from Wisconsin, where you played football during your 4 years there.
Yeah, not quite an investment decision, unless I was investing in a bad back and sore hips for the rest of my life. Yeah. I mean, I went to University of Wisconsin and was in the business school, got a degree in real estate, urban economics, and political science. Kind of always thought I would go straight into the business world, maybe get into finance. But it was an interesting time period. I'd been in school as a freshman on 9/11. And so my first 4 years of college were basically the first 4 years of the war on terror. And so when the time came to graduate, I just had to make this assessment. Was I ready to go sit at a desk and, start that part of my life? Or did I want to do something else? And so I chose to join the Marine Corps. Tough decision, led to a tough 4 years, but wouldn't regret it for the world.
And my guess is you learn a lot about leadership being a Marine in Iraq and Afghanistan that you certainly can't learn in a business context. Maybe, for most of our listeners who haven't had that experience, what do you learn about, camaraderie and team, being a member of a team and leadership that it's just really hard to replicate within an office setting?
Yeah, well, I was really fortunate because I'd spent 4 years at Wisconsin on the, varsity football team. So I already had a pretty great understanding of what it takes to be a good teammate and, establish that esprit de corps and be accountable to my teammates and all of that stuff. Obviously, that accelerated dramatically during my time in the Marine Corps. Stakes were a lot higher. I was in Iraq during, the surge. It was the bloodiest year of the war in Anbar province. And, later in Afghanistan, our unit took more casualties than I think any other Marine Corps battalion for the entire year. It's certainly not a source of pride. I mean, I think it was just, they were tough tours. And so you learn a lot about leadership. You learn a lot about, what it takes to hold yourself accountable, hold your platoon mates accountable. You learn a lot about, what it takes to lead in moments of crisis. It's hard to distill all of those lessons down into any one soundbite. The Marine Corps has an acronym for all of the leadership principles that it espouses, and the acronym is almost a running joke. It's JJ did tie buckle. Now I'm going to put myself on the spot, see if I can rattle these off. Justice, judgment, determination, integrity, dependability, tenacity, initiative, endurance, bravery, understanding, courage, knowledge, loyalty, and enthusiasm. And And it's like, that's a mouthful. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because all of those things are true. They're all equally critical ingredients to leading yourself and leading others.
I want to pull a little bit on that thread because accountability is something that I've thought deeply about, especially in the business or investing context. Like, is there anything that you learned specifically about accountability and like maybe the ability to have frank discussions with people or setting high expectations? I'd love to hear like whether it's football, whether it's Marines, whether it's, other things you've done. How have you thought about accountability as an important element of any culture in a business setting?
Yeah, I think one of the really great experiences I had was my first 2 years in the Marine Corps. I was in an infantry platoon, and the Marine Corps infantry, pretty highly regarded, one of the finest fighting forces on the planet. And I was a non-commissioned officer as a corporal, which meant that I had Marines under my charge, and I was responsible for their daily welfare as well as their leadership in combat. And you had to hold those Marines accountable. And it's not that they were bad Marines; it's just that they were more junior and perhaps less proficient in their tasks. My last 2 years, though, I was in a Marine Corps sniper team, and if the Marine Corps infantry is well regarded, Marine Corps sniper teams are legendary, and it's a very arduous process to try out for and be selected into a sniper platoon, and then even harder to get a spot and eventually graduate from sniper school. And so these are probably the most proficient, mature, and professional Marines in the Marine Corps. And so what was interesting was I really got this experience where I was surrounded by people who had such a high degree of personal accountability that my need or even ability to hold others accountable almost atrophied. Because you never had to have a performance conversation in that platoon. The moment that somebody screwed up, you didn't have to raise the point. They knew that they had screwed up. They were holding themselves accountable and they were going to fix themselves. And it was just this remarkably refreshing experience. And I think I often reflect back on that because it's how I try to build, teams today. It's how do I find people who are going to have initiative, pursue self-improvement, hold themselves accountable. Man, if you can do that, if you can build a density of that type of talent, you can conquer anything.
Yeah. And so you learned a lot about leadership and a number of experiences, and I'm interested in what prompted you to then write a couple books about leadership and your experiences. Like what did you think that was so important and special that you learned that you thought that it was worth sharing with the rest of the world?
Well, I think a lot of people who go to war, they come home and they write books, right? Some of them are good, some of them are bad. I think for me, writing was something I'd always done throughout my life. I was a fairly good writer in high school and college. I could articulate my thoughts pretty well. And so for me, writing was cathartic. I used writing to help process my experiences. It started when I was in Iraq, my first tour. I actually maintained a blog back when, kind of before blogs were a thing that everybody had, kind of like podcasts today, right? And so I started this blog, and it just became like really widely read. And it was just a really raw first person perspective of what was happening on the ground in Anbar province during the surge. So that first got me thinking about it. And again, for me, it was really an outlet in a way to help me process what I was experiencing, which was a lot of violence and death and all of that. And then, I got out of the Marine Corps, and I had these kind of radical experiences right away. We started this nonprofit Team Rubicon about 2 months after getting home, and it was just this really sensational period where we were kind of running around the globe responding to crises. And I started to think, God, there's kind of an interesting narrative here. Maybe there's a book. And so, I don't know, to cut to the chase, 2 or 3 years into running that nonprofit Team Rubicon, I got approached by a publisher to write a book. And they wanted me to write a book on leadership. And I said, I don't think I want to write a book on leadership. I think I'm a decent leader, but I'm an evolving leader. I don't have kind of a unified, rational view of leadership. It's a work in progress. And so I said, do you want to publish this memoir? Here's an outline. And they said, no, we want a leadership book. I said, all right, you're going to pay me? I'm going to write a leadership book. And in retrospect, part of me wishes I hadn't. I'd much rather write that book today than 10 years ago when it was published, because I actually think my views, perspectives, ideas, theories on leadership have evolved dramatically. But then 6 or 7 years later, back in 2020, I finally, wrote and finished that memoir that I'd always wanted to write, called Once a Warrior. It did really well. It was a commercial success. I still get notes from people from all around the country and around the world who read it and send me, notes that talk about the impact it had on their life or their transition out of the military. And, those are the notes that, beyond getting paid to write, like that's why you do it. Because if your words can help anyone in their journey, that's a really powerful thing.
And you mentioned in that response the situation and the circumstances that got you to think about starting Team Rubicon. Just as we're going through your journey as a person and as a leader, I'd love for you to share, the spark that led to the original founding of Team Rubicon.
Yeah. So for the listeners out there that are unfamiliar with the story, which is probably most of you, I got out of the Marine Corps in 2009. I'd done time in Iraq and Afghanistan. I had this decision to make about whether I was going to stay in the military or if I was going to get out after my first enlistment. And, ultimately I decided to get out. A lot of reasons for that. But about 2 months after getting out, I was waiting for application decisions to come back for grad school. I was applying to go get my MBA. And as I was waiting in January of 2010, so this is, again, about 2 months after I got out of the Marines, the earthquake, an earthquake hit Haiti. And, a lot of people may have forgotten how horrific that event was, but they estimate about 100,000 people died instantly and another 100 to 150,000 people died in the coming weeks and months. And so I sat there and watched that moment unfold, freshly out of the Marine Corps, and just felt inspired to do what I could. And so ended up organizing a team of veterans and doctors. And we went down to Haiti, the capital city of Port-au-Prince, about 4 days after the earthquake. And we started running medical triage clinics all throughout the city, helping. And it was just this wild experience. I mean, we were on the ground, running and gunning, doing work that, in parts of the city that other organizations just wouldn't even touch, helping people, especially over the first 2 or 3 days that we were on the ground. I mean, these people that we were treating had horrific injuries. I mean, it was like a Civil War battlefield every day. It was one of the most, certainly one of the most powerful experiences of my life. It was a horrific experience, but powerful experience. And at the conclusion of it, we realized that, the effectiveness of our team was really born of our experiences as military veterans and combat veterans, specifically the ability to navigate the chaos and, do rapid operational planning and risk mitigation and, security assessments and all of that stuff. So we came back, we incorporated this thing as a nonprofit. And, really with, I don't know that we had any grand ambition at the time. We just kind of wanted to see where it would go. And I ended up running that thing full time for 11 years. And it still is thriving today as probably the second largest disaster response organization in the country behind the Red Cross.
Such an incredible story. So what, one of the things we always like to focus on this podcast is like passing on the reins and knowing when it's time to move on. What was the decision like to step away as CEO and think about what was next for you?
Yeah, I think I'd always been thinking about stepping away since the beginning. I think that every organization is either constantly evolving or it's slowly dying. It's just like any organism, right? So if you're not adapting as the world around you changes, then you're not going to be long for this world. And so I was always very realistic with our stakeholders, whether they were donors or board members or volunteers, that I'd run the organizations for as long as I was the right person to run the organization. And there were moments when I thought that that was going to be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. There were moments at the 5-year mark where I thought maybe I had 12 or 18 months left, and then I stuck around for another 5 years. So I think I was always very sober about the idea that, this isn't what I'm going to do forever, both because I don't think that would be good for the organization, but also because I have, other things that I want to do. And part of that is I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I can't imagine running the same organization forever, because at a certain point, you're no longer an entrepreneur, you're just a CEO. And so in 2021, it was at the end of 2020, I had been doing it for 10 years. The organization was in a great place. We had survived COVID. And that was, a very important moment to realize, okay, we're not a lot. There were a lot of organizations that didn't survive. Yeah. And I had a great succession plan in place. My chief operating officer was fully ready to take the reins. And I realized that I was ready for the next thing. I wanted to be an entrepreneur again. I wanted to start and go from 0 to 1. We were at a stage at Team Rubicon. We weren't 0 to 1 anymore. We were 1 to 100. And there were parts of that were really fun and exciting and challenging. And there were parts of it that seemed kind of boring. And that's not to discredit anything that organization's still doing today, because they're having tremendous impact. And I'm excited that I can stay involved as chairman of the board. So it was just really the perfect opportunity for me.
And of all the things that you could have done after Team Rubicon, where did the idea for Groundswell come from? And how did you know, what was the spark that said this is worth pursuing?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that had always caused me to hesitate leaving not running Team Rubicon was this idea that, I wanted to make sure that the next thing that I did was as impactful, had as much purpose. But I wanted to do it as a for-profit. And so, that kind of narrows the range of possibilities down pretty substantially. And so when I finally made the decision to step down from Team Rubicon, I didn't have what the next thing was going to be. I just knew I needed to make the decision. So as soon as I had the time and space, I started to, do some assessment about, what are the possibilities? And, I kind of started with, what do I know well? I've spent 11 years doing this thing. What did I learn? And I learned a lot about disaster response. And there's actually tremendous business opportunities in disaster response. And I learned a lot about philanthropy. We raised over $300 million while I was running Team Rubicon in philanthropic contributions. That's a lot of money. And we raised it from, grassroots donors, billionaire family offices, corporations, and foundations. And I had a pretty good grasp of all of that. And so came up with this idea for Groundswell. We ended up raising venture money back in 2021, back when you could still raise VC money, led by Google Ventures. And the thesis was, how do we build tools that help democratize philanthropy? And what's that mean, to democratize philanthropy? There's kind of two things. One, for decades, high net worth individuals have used really powerful vehicles for their giving, specifically the rise of donor advised funds, but they've been totally inaccessible to average people. And so, we thought that with some of the advances in fintech tools, that we could build the world's most modern donor advised fund and make it more affordable and accessible to anybody, so that they could give to charity more efficiently from a tax perspective. The second thing was, I had raised a lot of money from companies, and I knew that there's a ton of money that is flowing to charitable causes through big corporate brands, big and small, not just big ones. And they're just really bad at giving away that money. Some of them better than others, but generally speaking, they're just pretty bad at it. And they're bad for a couple of reasons, but one of the ways in which they're bad is that they think that they're getting something for their philanthropy. And whether they admit it or not, they all want something in return for cutting these checks, right? They either want good PR, right? It's a corporate affairs effort where they want to create a halo effect in the community in which they're working, or they want to motivate and inspire employees. And they usually fall short on both, particularly in the latter one, motivating and inspiring employees. And so, our kind of approach to democratizing philanthropy there was, how do you build tools that actually empower employees to give that money away? And so that it's not a centralized decision, but rather a decentralized decision. And the result was, we built this donor advised fund that companies give to employees as a benefit. and then give or match funds through them, effectively empowering those employees to be the agents of that company's social impact mission. And we're excited about the prospects.
And my sense is that you were of the impression that there are aspects of the legacy donor advisor funds that have some limitations. Can you talk a little bit about the limitations, maybe the expenses associated with those, and then talk about how Groundswell's use technology to address some of those issues?
Yeah, legacy donor advised fund or DAF providers, they range from like the Fidelities and Charles Schwab's of the world to more of the wealth management institutions like a Morgan Stanley or a Goldman Sachs. And I mean the platforms themselves are just outdated. It's their legacy platforms. These are typically kind of afterthought products for those companies. Fidelity is not in the charitable giving business, despite having the largest donor advised fund in the world. They are a brokerage, make no mistake about it. And so the tools that they're building for DAFs are really brokerages in disguise, which means a couple of things. One, they're not investing in those tools, but two, those tools are designed simply to accumulate more assets under management for the brokerage, which means that they're not actually facilitating effectively money moving to charity. It's not their economic incentive to do so. And so we felt like it was important for us to build a tool that was actually incentivizing people to move money to charity more effectively. And we aligned our economic incentives to do that. But we also just wanted to build a more modern version of this. So it's a native mobile app. It looks and feels like any modern fintech app that users have on their phone that are doing their banking or their Venmo or any of that stuff. And I think the result has been a beautiful user-friendly app. It's rated 5 stars on the App Store. Anybody can go and create a donor advised fund in 60 seconds. And again, it's not been the case historically.
And there's always a risk, of course, in any startup venture where you're going against some legacy incumbents, that they have the ability to pivot to cater to people outside of the wealthiest individuals. Do you have a sense that they care or are set up that way, or is that something doesn't really worry you, that one day Fidelity is going to wake up and be like, we need to modernize this DAF platform because this is what we're really missing?
Bring it on. I mean, competition's good. It's good for the space. It's good for us. It keeps our edges sharp, and I've never shied away from competition. Could they conceivably crush us? Sure. Do I think that they will? No. I mean, it's the old speedboat versus aircraft carrier analogy. Like, yeah, they might have a desire to turn and innovate. Will they do it? I don't know.
And when you're speaking to potential customers, are the decision makers typically aware of the pain points associated with a DAF that is already in place, or is there some education required? Meaning, like, I'm a CFO or a head of finance somewhere, and like we have one of these things at my firm, but I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Like, do you have to educate them, be like, no, it's expensive and it's really hard to use, or do people have a sense of the limitations?
It's interesting. It really depends on the company and the buyer. So if we're selling to a large company that's got like a formal corporate social responsibility team, those folks are pretty wise on donor advised funds. But maybe they've never really thought about it as an employee benefit, right? That's entirely novel. So for some CSR professionals, they encounter us for the first time, and they say, "Oh, that's really cool. I know rich people had these. I've never thought of them as a tool for our employee-driven philanthropy." But if we're selling into a company that the buyer is like human resources, or you mentioned CFOs, yeah, it typically can throw some sand in the gears in the sale, because it becomes entirely consultative. They have no idea what the DAF is, and that can be an intimidating conversation for some folks. And so, in full transparency, like, we've had to adjust tactics based off of who we're having the conversation with. And there are some situations in which we don't even talk about DAFs. We just talk about, hey, we can match employee donations in the most elegant and effortless way possible. And by the way, that's a great employee benefit to have that puts you on parity with some of the largest, most well-known companies in the US.
And under the heading of democratizing charitable giving, I'm interested in hearing about the idea of everyone having a personal foundation and how that is different from how you feel people typically donate now. Like what is that? It just seems like a really cool concept that would be broadly applicable and interesting to people. What is the idea of a personal foundation in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, a donor advised fund, for all intents and purposes, is like having a personal foundation, right? It is a tax advantage charitable giving vehicle that has all the tax advantages of a personal foundation, but none of the administration. So there's a lot of advantages. There's a reason why a lot of rich people use them. And we really have tried to shift the way that people think about their philanthropy, whereas today it's often scattered or it's one-off. We want to make it more deliberate. We want people to be more strategic about it. We want folks to think about, how can I do this more efficiently? Am I getting all of the tax advantages of this generosity that I have? But we also want people to start thinking about legacy, right? I think that's something that people kind of flirt with when they're young. Some people are more deliberate about kind of planning their life around less about their resume and more about their eulogy, if you've ever heard that example. But we encounter people every day, every week that are thinking about, hey, how am I leaving the world a better place? And so being able to pull all of your efforts into a single giving vehicle allows you to start creating that legacy over time. And sometimes it's the simple things. You might be a runner that runs a 5K every year or a marathon every year and chooses a different charity to raise money for. That's great. There's a lot of people that do that. But every single year, you're restarting that legacy. You're going and you're raising money for the American Cancer Society over here. You're using their giving tools. And then the next year, you're raising money for, whatever, the Alzheimer's Association. And that history of year one to year two is disconnected and fragmented. And instead, we're building tools where you can say, hey, I'm running this marathon. I'm raising money into the Wood Family Foundation because the Wood family cares about giving back, and we're going to distribute those funds, every year to a variety of causes, not just one like the American Cancer Society, but all the things that matter to us. And then the next year when I run again, I'm still raising money into that Wood Family Foundation. And I'm starting to build this legacy over time of what we've accomplished in giving back.
And I'm wondering, given how much, consumer society has changed, and I think people have become much more comfortable having a number of subscriptions, are there nudges or are there ways in which you can start to get people to think of this as not a, one-off, but more like this is a recurring thing? Every year I give to the same charities. Like, is that part of the technology to help people, like, obviously they're thinking about a long-term legacy, but more even in the short run, just be more consistent with their giving?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. We try to nudge our users into recurring actions all the time. And, so with this as a giving vehicle, you can set up a payroll deduction directly into your giving account. You can do automated ACH contributions into your giving account. And then, of course, you can set up a whole portfolio of nonprofits that you're supporting with donations on a monthly basis. It's all getting routed through this one single account. So it's consolidating all of your tax receipting. The transaction fees are much less. There's a lot of people out there that have recurring donations to charity that they do online, but they're paying 4% every single month on that amount, right? Because of the way we've built our technology, our platform fees are 1%. So even just consolidating all of those monthly gifts through their Groundswell account is just more efficient.
I mean, it just seems like so obvious and such a home run for both. It's just a win-win-win across all the constituents. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the typical profile of a firm, maybe in terms of size or industry, that would be a good client for Groundswell, do you think?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I knew from my experience running a nonprofit is that Fortune 500 companies have been doing this type of stuff for a long time. There's 3 legacy players that they often use, big kind of clunky platforms that facilitate this stuff. Not the donor advised fund element, just the donation matching element. We're entirely unique in the donor advised fund element. But those existing platforms are so clunky, they can't serve smaller firms. So we saw really an opportunity to open up the addressable market here by building a solution that could just as easily be used at a 10-person company as a 10,000-person company. And so that's literally the range of our customers. We've got firms that are 10 people, and we've got 10,000-person companies on the same platform with the same implementation burden. So What we found though is we've got some niches where we do really well. Investment management firms are one of them. These tend to be smaller firms. Often the managing partners have, because they are well compensated. These are highly compensated people. They usually have a history of giving back, and there's this, I think, this emotional element of those managing partners thinking to themselves like, hey, I can turn my team into philanthropists as well. I can empower them to be as generous as I am, even if it's at a different scale, right? And so we have, I don't know, two dozen investment management firms ranging from 10-person shops to 250-person shops, and we're about to work with a couple that are closer to 1,000-person firms, which is really exciting. Generally speaking, though, where we see the most success is kind of professional service firms more broadly, accounting, tax advisory types, law firms, IT services firms. Again, people that generally more highly compensated, high median education levels, again, because there are elements of the platform that, the tax advantages and things like that people really want to wrap their minds around. But, any company that wants to be generous, we can power it.
And one thing we talked about when we met that I hadn't really thought about was a privacy angle, but it makes a lot of sense. Can you talk about why that's important to Groundswell and its customers, the ability to give, to any charity without the employer even knowing where the money went?
Yeah. So if you think about what a traditional employee donation matching program looks like, Ben, you work for a company that does this, you donate to a nonprofit, you got to submit that receipt to HR or to finance. They've got to process it and they've got to send that matching check to the charity. And if you're supporting the local animal shelter, who cares? It's pretty benign. But if you're supporting Planned Parenthood or, whatever the conservative alternative to that is, those are very politicized, polarizing issues, and you may not be comfortable, disclosing that internally. You might know that the person you're submitting that receipt to is on the opposite side of that spectrum as you, and that you don't want to create that, that weird moment. The other reason is, for a lot of people, their philanthropy is deeply personal. It's informed by, events that happened in their life. You might be a recovered alcoholic supporting AA, and you don't want HR to know that, or you could have grown up in a broken home and you don't like talking about it, but you support a battered women's shelter. So, the way our platform works is employees receive their eligible matches from their company into their giving account, into their donor advised fund, which then allows them to then distribute both their contribution and the match to charity however, whenever they want, without having to disclose where they're sending it. So creating that firewall, that level of privacy is really important to allowing employees to participate as authentically as they want without fear of, that exposure.
And then once a customer signs on and gets the employees engaged, my guess is that there's virtually zero incentive to switch providers. Can you talk about just what you've seen in terms of switching costs and your sense of retention should look like as this business matures and scales and you kind of find the right types of businesses to work with?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I think that you are right. You should be right. What's interesting, though, is that we're seeing a lot of companies come to us looking to get off those legacy platforms. They are dissatisfied with the user experience. They're dissatisfied with the customer service. They're dissatisfied with the administrative burden that they thought they were getting rid of, but they really just swapped one admin task for another. And so I think, despite these platforms having deep hooks in these enterprise companies, those enterprise companies are saying enough's enough. So, they are willing to switch, but it's because these legacy platforms aren't delivering on, what they promise. So we're really laser focused on building a world-class employee experience, having a human-centric customer service model, ensuring that companies can report on the impact that they're having. If we can do that, then I agree, we'll be pretty sticky.
And I've used your tech and I found it very intuitive. It feels to me like there are other applications outside of maybe the corporate setting. So is there anywhere else, maybe even, going back to your background in sports, where you feel like Groundswell can play?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. We are exploring some angles with sports. We think that there's a real opportunity there. Athletes tend to want to give back as they have success, and so I played with a lot of guys that went pro from Wisconsin, and a lot of them got deeply involved in the community. So one thesis that we have is that why not start those athletes on that journey in college? There's some unique opportunities that have opened up with recent kind of deregulation of NCAA rules around name, image, likeness, or otherwise known as NIL. And so just this week, we announced a partnership with UCLA's quarterback, Chase Griffin. He's raising money through Groundswell for the LA Food Bank. And we're having conversations with a number of professional teams as well. How can you get fans and players and brands all aligned on a single platform, tapping into those brands' cause marketing budgets, tapping into those fans' desire to connect more closely with players, and then ultimately those players' desire to have impact in the community. We see that as an exciting nexus point.
Yeah, it just feels like there's a lot of different applicable areas where you can play. And so in terms of the business model and the financial profile, which we haven't really talked about yet, maybe let's start with the basic question. Given all of that you just described and the benefits, like how does this company make money?
Yeah, well, we're a software company. We're a B2B SaaS company. We charge other companies for licensing fees for use of the platform. That's our primary revenue driver. I would say that we anticipate 85 to 90% of our revenue coming from those fees. We do take a transaction fee of money moving through the platform, 1%, which I mentioned. Historically, that's 3 to 4% less than competitive both platforms and or online credit card donations. And obviously, we do then monetize assets under management, but for us, that is kind of a de minimis amount of revenue relative to the other streams. And kind of as I said earlier, we don't want that to be our economic incentive because, frankly, I don't think that does any good for the world.
Yeah. And always like a business model that has some subscription element plus some transactional element. I mean, that sounds like a business that's going to scale really nicely. How have you thought about the level of profitability a business like this can actually achieve? I know, you're in the earlier stages, but what, any analogs that people might understand or know about that you think that they could point to and say, this is kind of what we would hope to look like when we grow up?
We don't have anybody we're looking to look like when we grow up. We're trying to blaze our own trail. But what I will say is, I think that this can be, if we look out 3, 4, 5 years, this is a very high margin company. Again, there's been some really incredible evolution in financial technology that allows us to do what we're doing relatively cheaply. We're not even close to being there yet. We're, cash flow negative like most venture-backed businesses. We've got to raise additional funding to even have a prayer at that profitability in the future. But there's certainly a pathway to it. I think that this is a business that can be throwing off a lot of cash in the future.
Got it. And the name of this podcast is Compounders. So we also like to think about the ways in which a business can become more valuable over time, whether it's the TAM or the first mover advantage. How does Groundswell become a lot more valuable in 10 years than it is today?
Well, that sounds like trade secrets.
But maybe talk about the market size, right? I think that would help people frame what the opportunity is for you guys if you can execute.
Yeah. Well, as I said, the platforms that exist today, they all have billion-dollar plus market caps, and they are limited almost entirely to enterprise customers just because of the way their tech is built. So I think, one, it's how do we capture that enterprise market share from them by delivering what their customers are hungry for, but then how do we then attack down market from there, expand through mid-market companies and down into SMBs to dramatically expand the TAM? That's kind of the first thing. The second thing then is what are the kind of the second act products that we can think about? So, the nonprofit landscape is dramatically underserved. There aren't great tools for nonprofits out there. and yet they do a $500 billion a year in revenue, so not insignificant. We've got a long way to go in the amount of throughput that we're putting on our platform, but there's certainly a world in which we're moving enough money to nonprofits that there are products we can build that serve them better to connect to Groundswell that we could monetize. There's other things that we're looking at as kind of second act peripheral products, but that would probably be the most natural one and the least proprietary.
And a lot of the entrepreneurs I've talked to highlight the importance of focus, especially in the early days. How have you thought about focusing on just that core that you're targeting versus what you just mentioned, already starting to think about what the second act can be? How do you balance those things to make sure that people on the team and even yourself don't get focused on something that is not, maybe that's 3 years out versus, something that we have to pay attention to this very moment as we're trying to scale it?
I mean, you're right. Focus is in the name of the game. We aim to be world class in what we do. My team would probably laugh because I'm well known for saying the words, "We have to earn the right." And so we can dream about expanding our product line into platforms that support our nonprofit recipients of the money we're moving, but we have to earn the right to build that. We haven't earned the right yet. So sure, feel free to dream about it and then get to work earning the right to do it.
Yeah, I like that. And you already mentioned that the fundraising environment for startups has gotten more challenging. How are you guys managing through that? Have you had to change your focus at all given the external environment, or is it just kind of you have your marching orders and you're following that and understanding that there may need to be some more capital at some point?
Yeah, well, we know we're going to need some more capital at some point. We've been making moves to control burn, and we ended up extending our seed round and raising an additional $2.5 million from existing, about half from existing investors and another half from existing customers, which I think is a really powerful testament to what we've built. So we're well capitalized for our plan. We've got 2 years of cash, roughly speaking, and obviously the hope is that we both build a company that's reaching the necessary milestones to justify our next round, but also that we're timing that raise in an environment that is much more friendly to Series A rounds than the current one is.
And another thing we often ask entrepreneurs in this podcast is built to last or built to sell, right? The idea, a lot of founders are building things to sell versus, something that, they could, run for a long time or could continue, with the same management team for a while. How have you thought about that concept of and as you're thinking about building this thing into something much bigger, is there a difference between something that's built to sell versus built to kind of, be around and last and be independent?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I think built to sell companies are fairly transparent. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, you want to get rich quick product, a lot of people make a lot of money doing that. That's not really my mindset. I can't really imagine that. I get very emotionally invested into the things that I'm building. Obviously there's no build to sell scenario for a nonprofit. So when I was running and building Team Rubicon, we always spoke about building an organization that was going to last 100 years. And there's something really powerful, I think, about that mentality. I don't know what the future holds for Groundswell, but our aspiration is that we build kind of an industry shaping company, and we have really no interest in getting gobbled up by one of the legacy players. I think that off ramp would be pretty easy to reach, but I don't think we want to settle for easy milestones.
Sure. And you mentioned some of the differences between running a nonprofit and a for-profit business. I would love to hear, having done both, any noticeable differences in terms of operations, leadership, dealing with people, what it's like to have outside investors versus raising money via charitable contributions. Interested in just the differences in your experiences as a nonprofit versus a for-profit CEO.
Listen, it's really the same, to be honest. I think, particularly in this environment, right? If money was still free, I think it would maybe be a little bit different because you could be a lot more liberal with your spend and count on the next round. But I think in a world in which there's a scarcity of money, like that's what a nonprofit is, every day, every week, every year. And so in some ways, I think that experience suited me well for the environment that we're in, because you have to be a lot more judicious in how you grow, how you spend, and how you invest. So, but listen, people are the same. The challenges are the same. Strategy is the same. The books look a little bit different, but, I feel as though running a nonprofit was some of the best training ground I could have ever had as an entrepreneur. Because again, it's a world in which resources are scarce.
And I guess both of your companies have a mission orientation, but obviously Team Rubicon is, like people are out there, physically, risking themselves to be part of a mission. Have you found it a little more difficult to get people on board with the mission at Groundswell, or is a charitable aspect, very appealing to people who want to work at Groundswell?
I think, listen, the incentives are different. Obviously, there's no equity that you can give at a nonprofit. And so, there are different levers that you can pull to attract and retain talent at a company like Groundswell. But there's no doubt in my mind that this is a mission-first company. The equity's nice. It's great. Hopefully we can help people secure their financial futures with that. But the people that we have here are people that believe deeply in what we're doing, and they want to be a part of a company, an exciting technology company that isn't just building a platform to ship cat food faster to your front door, but rather like do something really meaningful in the world.
So, you talked a lot about people there. I'm interested in the cultural values that are most important to you as you're building Groundswell. Like what kind of, you talked about a huge number of acronyms from the Marines. Have you condensed that a little bit as you're building Groundswell?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't yet defined fully our values. We're 2.5 years into this, and I think it takes a while for that culture to really form and for you to really be able to distill it down into 3, 4, 5 value statements. And so we're not in a rush to do that. Of course, we focus on culture a lot. We talk about values, but we don't have those, whatever you'd call them, the values that you hang up on the wall fully baked yet. But when I talk about 3 things that I expect in everybody that works for me, the first one's initiative. We've got too much to do for people to be sitting around waiting to be told what to do. Second one's tenacity. It's not worth starting something if you're not going to finish it, regardless of what information you have or resources you have. And then the last one's enthusiasm. There's no use in having a ton of initiative, having a ton of tenacity, and being a total asshole. So, be enthusiastic about the opportunity to come and work for this company every day, and be the type of person that people are eager to see on Monday morning. And if you do those 3 things consistently, for me, you're going to be successful, and we're going to be successful.
And if we're having this discussion again in 5 years and Groundswell's been a success in your eyes, what would that look like?
What would that look like? I mean, I think we're moving multiple billions of dollars a year to charity. I think that the idea of a tax advantage charitable giving account is becoming ubiquitous in certain industries as a part of their compensation package.
Got it. And is there a way that Groundswell can kind of push that initiative, right? Is there a PR or some way to work with athletes or celebrities to get that idea out there? Is that part of the mission?
Hell yeah, it's part of the mission. What do you think I'm waking up every day trying to do? If you've got some secret strategy, let me know. Otherwise, we're grinding trying to make it a reality.
Yeah, nice. So we're going to close this really interesting interview with the question that we always ask about companies is like, what do you think is the most underappreciated aspect of Groundswell?
Great question. I think it would be the elegance of our solution, specifically, just this idea of using a donor advised fund as the mechanism, the pipes through which a company can empower its employees to give. Like the tax advantages aside, it's allowed us to just build a more elegant experience for both employee and the administrators in those companies. And I think that's often lost on people because they're thinking about the tax implications, and really the tax implications are just kind of like a nice to have relative to the simplicity that we can afford people.
I think there's been a lot of companies that have done really well just making a very difficult process more simple and being, kind of customer first. So, I use a product. I thought it was great. And I met you and I thought that you had, really, the characteristics that would make a very interesting, leader and founder CEO. So we're going to be watching your career very closely. Jake, thanks so much for being on Compounders.
Yeah, thank you for having me.